I still remember the sound of their laughter. Sharp, cutting through the afternoon air like broken glass. It followed me as I loaded the last of my belongings into what used to be a plumber's work van. A beat-up 2012 Ford Transit with rust creeping up its sides and a door that stuck when it rained, which in Seattle was almost every day. Sarah's really lost it this time. I heard my neighbor whisper to her husband as they pretended to water plants that were already drowning. Moving into a van like some kind of homeless person. The word stung because they weren't entirely wrong. 3 months earlier, I'd been laid off from my marketing job at a tech startup that burned through investor money faster than I burned through my savings trying to stay afloat. The unemployment checks barely covered my studio apartment rent, let alone food, let alone the student loans that followed me like hungry ghosts. I'd sold my car, my furniture, most of my clothes. Everything that once defined my life as a successful 28-year-old woman had been stripped away, piece by expensive piece. But it was my sister's laughter that cut the deepest. When I called to tell her about my plan, the silence stretched so long, I thought the call had dropped. Then came that sound, not cruel exactly, but pitying in a way that made my skin crawl. "Oh, Sarah," she said, and I could picture her shaking her perfectly styled head in her perfectly decorated suburban home. "You can't be serious. What will people think? What will Mom and Dad say when they find out their daughter is living like a vagrant?" I hung up without answering because I didn't have an answer. All I had was $847 in my checking account, a van I'd bought from a contractor who took pity on me, and a desperate need to believe that sometimes the only way forward is to completely change direction. The van smelled like sawdust and motor oil, mixed with the lingering ghost of whoever had eaten egg salad sandwiches in the driver's seat for the past 6 years. I'd spent 2 weeks watching YouTube videos about van conversions, learning words like inverter and gray water and off-grid, as if they were a foreign language I needed to become fluent in to survive. My conversion wasn't Instagram-worthy. I couldn't afford the sleek cabinetry or the solar panels that gleamed like promises of freedom in all the Vanlife videos I'd been obsessively watching. Instead, I had a foam mattress from Walmart, a portable camping stove that terrified me every time I lit it, and a cooler that I had to fill with ice every 2 days if I wanted my food to stay fresh. The only luxury I'd allowed myself was a small battery pack to charge my phone, my last tether to the world I was leaving behind. That first night, parked in a Walmart parking lot in Bellingham, I lay on my thin mattress listening to the rain. Drum against the metal roof like impatient fingers. The van felt impossibly small and impossibly large at the same time. Small, because I could touch both walls if I stretched out my arms. Large because it contained my entire life now, and the weight of that reality pressed down on my chest until I thought I might suffocate. I cried that night. Ugly, desperate tears that I muffled with a pillow I'd grabbed from my old apartment, because it still smelled like the fabric softener I used to buy without checking the price. I cried for the life I'd lost, for the judgment in people's voices, for the terrifying uncertainty of what came next. But somewhere between the tears and the rain, I felt something else creeping in, something that took me days to name. Freedom. Not the pretty, Instagram kind of freedom that comes with trust funds and gap years in Europe. This was raw, necessary freedom. The freedom that comes when you've lost everything you thought defined you and realized you're still breathing. Still here, still capable of making choices, even if they're the kinds of choices that make people laugh and whisper behind cupped hands. The rain stopped sometime before dawn, and I woke to sunlight streaming through the small window I'd left uncovered. Outside, the Olympic Mountains rose like ancient guardians, their peaks touched with snow that caught the morning light, and threw it back in shades of pink and gold I'd never noticed when I was rushing to catch buses and make meetings and live the life everyone expected me to live. I made coffee on my terrifying little stove, burning my tongue because I was too eager for the comfort of routine. The coffee was terrible. Instant crystals dissolved in water that tasted faintly of plastic from my storage container. But it was my coffee, made in my home, however strange and temporary and uncertain that home might be. And for the first time, in months, I felt something that might have been hope stirring in my chest, like embers beginning to catch fire. The next few weeks blurred together in a haze of learning curves steep enough to make my head spin. I learned that my body heat could fog up every window in the van within minutes, turning my morning routine into a game of blind woman's bluff until I figured out ventilation. I learned that finding places to shower required the kind of strategic planning usually reserved for military operations, and that Planet Fitness memberships were worth their weight in gold for reasons I'd never considered before. But I also learned things I hadn't expected. I learned that sunrises look different when you're watching them through a windshield instead of rushing past them on your way to somewhere else. I learned that strangers at gas stations would sometimes strike up conversations that lasted longer than most of the interactions I'd had with coworkers back in my old life. I learned that I could drive for hours with nothing but my thoughts and the road ahead. And instead of feeling lonely, I felt like I was finally meeting myself for the first time. 3 weeks into my van life adventure, I was parked at a trailhead in Oregon, trying to figure out how to make ramen noodles seem like a legitimate dinner for the 4th time that week, when I noticed someone had left a comment on one of the photos I'd posted on Instagram. I'd been documenting my journey partly out of habit. I was still a marketer at heart, even if I no longer had anything to market except my own survival. And partly because talking into the void of social media felt less pathetic than talking to myself in an empty van. The comment was from a woman named Lisa. "I've been watching your story and I have to ask, how do you find safe places to park? I've been thinking about doing something similar, but I'm terrified." I stared at her words for a long time, the cursor blinking on my phone screen like a heartbeat. Someone was watching. Someone was asking. Someone needed to know something I had learned through necessity and fear, and the kind of trial and error education that left you exhausted and exhilarated in equal measure. I typed back, "It's scarier in your imagination than in reality. Start with well-lit places where other RVs park. Apps like iOverlander and Compendium are lifesavers. Most importantly, trust your gut. If a place feels wrong, leave." Within an hour, 3 more people had asked follow-up questions. By the end of the week, my direct messages were full of people asking about everything from solar setups to composting toilets, to how to tell your family you're choosing a life that looks like failure from the outside but feels like salvation. From the inside, I started answering every question, partly because I remembered how desperately I'd searched for real, honest information when I was planning my escape, and partly because helping others felt like the first useful thing I'd done in months. These weren't the glossy van life influencers with their perfect builds and enviable trust funds. These were real people facing real problems, looking for real solutions. People like Marcus, a military veteran whose PTSD made traditional housing feel like a trap he couldn't escape. Like Elena, a single mother whose divorce had left her with custody of her 10-year-old son and not enough money to afford rent in any city with decent schools. Like James, who'd been laid off at 55 and blacklisted from his industry for being a whistleblower, watching his savings evaporate while he tried to rebuild a career that might not exist anymore. They found me because I was honest about the parts of van life that Instagram never showed. The night I food poisoned myself with questionable gas station sushi and had to drive to 3 different Walmart parking lots before finding one with a bathroom that wasn't locked at midnight. The week I spent in Flagstaff because my alternator died and I couldn't afford to fix it immediately, rationing my phone battery and eating peanut butter sandwiches while I waited for my freelance check to clear. But I was also honest about the unexpected gifts. The morning I woke up on a beach in Northern California and realized I'd fallen asleep to the sound of waves, and that the first thing I saw when I opened my eyes was an endless horizon instead of a ceiling, with a water stain shaped like anxiety. The elderly couple in Sedona who invited me to their campfire and told me stories about their own adventures in a 1970s Airstream, how they'd been living on the road for 15 years and had never once regretted choosing motion over security. People started asking if I could help them plan their own transitions. Not just casual advice in Instagram comments, but real help. Detailed plans, shopping lists, route suggestions, safety protocols for solo female travelers, budget breakdowns that accounted for the hidden costs everyone else seemed to gloss over. Started charging for consultations, partly because my savings were getting scary thin, and partly because I was spending so much time helping others that I wasn't working the freelance marketing gigs that were supposed to be keeping me afloat. $25 for a 30-minute phone call felt reasonable, fair. A way to value my time while still making my help accessible to people who, like me, were operating on desperation budgets. The first person who paid me was Elena, the single mother. We spent an hour on the phone while she was at work, talking in whispers, because she couldn't let her colleagues know she was planning an exit strategy that involved moving her son into a converted school bus. She cried when I told her it was possible, when I walked her through the logistics of homeschooling on the road and finding communities of traveling families who made sure no kid ever felt isolated or weird for living differently. "You saved my life," she said at the end of the call, and I knew she meant it literally. That night, I sat in my van watching the sun set over the painted desert, holding my phone and staring at the $25 that had appeared in my PayPal account. It wasn't much. It wouldn't even fill my gas tank. But it was the first money I'd earned by helping someone, instead of selling them something they probably didn't need. It was the first money that felt clean. Within a month, I was booked solid. Word spread through the hidden networks of people who were tired of spending half their income on rent, tired of jobs that demanded their souls in exchange for health, insurance, tired of living in cities where they couldn't afford to actually live. I raised my rates to $50 per consultation, then $75. Not because I was greedy, but because I was drowning in demand and needed to create some breathing room. People paid it gladly, desperately. They were buying more than advice. They were buying permission to believe that another way was possible. I started creating guides, digital downloads with titles like The Real Cost of Vanlife, A Month-by-Month Budget Breakdown, and Solo Female Van Travel, Safety Strategies That Actually Work. Each guide was priced at $27, a number I chose because it felt substantial enough to be valuable, but accessible enough for people who were counting every penny, the way I had been just months earlier. The guides sold while I slept, parked in national forests and beach towns and desert pull-offs. I'd wake up to notifications that felt like Christmas morning every single day. Not just because of the money, but because each sale represented someone taking a step toward a life that felt more like theirs. By my 6th month on the road, I was making more money than I had at my corporate job. Not because I was trying to get rich, but because I was solving real problems for real people who had nowhere else to turn. I was the person I'd needed when I was loading my belongings into a rust-stained van, while neighbors laughed and family, members worried about what people would think. The morning I checked my bank balance and saw 6 figures for the first time in my life, I was parked at sunrise on the rim of the Grand Canyon. The number seemed impossible, surreal, like a glitch in the universe that would correct itself as soon as someone noticed the mistake. But it wasn't a mistake. It was the accumulation of months of helping people bridge the gap between the lives they were living and the lives they actually wanted. I called my sister that day, the same sister who'd laughed when I told her about the van, who'd worried about what people would think, who'd pitied me for choosing uncertainty over the security of a life that was slowly killing me. "Sarah?" she answered, and I could hear the surprise in her voice. We hadn't talked since Christmas, when she'd asked if I was still doing that van thing, with the tone someone might use to ask about a hobby they found vaguely embarrassing. "I'm a millionaire," I said without preamble, because I'd rehearsed this conversation 100 times in my head, but never imagined I'd actually have it. The silence stretched long enough for me to wonder if the call had dropped. Then, "What?" "I'm a millionaire," I repeated, looking out at the canyon that stretched endlessly in every direction, a reminder that some things are too big and too beautiful to be contained by other people's ideas of what's possible. "The van thing? It's my business now. I help people transition to van life, and I'm making more money than I ever made in corporate. I'm making more money than I ever thought possible." Another silence. Then quietly, "Are you happy?" It was the first time anyone had asked me that question in years, maybe decades. I thought about it as I watched the canyon walls catch and throw the morning light, as I felt the solid reliability of my van beneath me. No longer a symbol of failure, but a home that could take me anywhere I wanted to go. "Yes," I said, and meant it completely. "I'm happy." The conversation after that was different. She asked real questions about my business, about how I'd figured out what people needed, about whether I was lonely or scared, or if I missed having a permanent address. She listened when I told her about the community I'd found among people who'd chosen motion over stagnation, about the clients who sent me pictures of their own van builds and stories of adventures that started with terror and ended with transformation. "Mom's been worried," she said before we hung up. "She saw your Instagram posts and keeps asking if we should stage an intervention." I laughed, but not cruelly. I understood their concern. From the outside, my choice had looked like a breakdown. From the inside, it felt like the first authentic decision I'd made in years. "Tell her I'm okay," I said. "Tell her I'm more than okay. Tell her that sometimes what looks like falling apart is actually falling together." A year later, I was featured in Forbes as one of 30 entrepreneurs under 30 to watch. The article called me the Vanlife Millionaire and talked about how I'd built a 7-figure business helping people transition from traditional housing to life on the road. They interviewed some of my clients, Elena and her son, who'd been traveling for 8 months and had never been happier. Marcus, who'd found healing in motion that years of therapy hadn't been able to provide. James, who'd started his own consulting business from his converted Sprinter van and was booking more work than he'd ever managed from a traditional office. The photographer who came to shoot my portrait was expecting someone who looked like the polished van life influencers she'd seen online. Instead, she found me in a t-shirt and hiking boots, my hair in a messy bun, my hands stained with engine grease because I'd been helping a fellow traveler fix their alternator in the parking lot of a Lowe's in Utah. "This isn't what I expected," she admitted, adjusting her camera settings while I washed my hands with a baby wipe. "Good," I said. "If this was what people expected, everyone would already be doing it." The article came out on a Tuesday. By Thursday, my website had crashed from traffic, and my email inbox was so full of interview requests and collaboration offers that I couldn't read them all. Everyone wanted to know the secret, the formula, the 5-step plan to turn alternative, living into alternative income. But there wasn't a secret. There wasn't a formula. There was just the willingness to help people solve problems that actually mattered to them, to be honest, about both the challenges and the rewards of choosing a path that looked crazy from the outside but felt essential from the inside. The real wealth wasn't the money in my bank account, though that certainly made life easier and gave me options I'd never had before. The real wealth was waking up every morning in a different place if I wanted to, or staying put for weeks if a location called to me. It was helping people find their own versions of freedom, their own ways of defining success that had nothing to do with other people's expectations, and everything to do with their own deep knowing of what they needed to thrive. The real wealth was in the messages I received almost daily from people who'd taken the leap, who'd faced their own chorus of laughter and judgment and chosen courage anyway. People who'd discovered that home wasn't a place but a feeling, that security wasn't something you could buy with a mortgage, but something you built by learning to trust yourself completely. Now, when people ask me about the laughter, when they want to know if it hurt, if I ever regretted ignoring the voices that said I was crazy, if I ever missed the life I left behind, I tell them the truth. The laughter was the best thing that ever happened to me. Not because it felt good, it didn't, but because it forced me to examine what I was really afraid of. Was I afraid of living in a van? Or was I afraid of what people would think about me living in a van? Was I afraid of uncertainty? Or was I afraid of admitting that the certainty I'd been chasing had never made me happy? The laughter taught me that other people's opinions of my choices were none of my business. That the only approval I needed was my own. That sometimes the things that look like mistakes from the outside are actually the beginning of everything you never knew you wanted. I still live in a van, though it's a different van now. A 2020 Mercedes Sprinter with solar panels. And a composting toilet and cabinetry that doesn't embarrass me when other van lifers peek inside. But I kept one thing from my original setup. That foam mattress from Walmart. It's worn thin in places, and probably should have been replaced years ago. But it reminds me of that first night when I cried myself to sleep and woke up to a sunrise that changed everything. Sometimes I park in the same Walmart parking lot in Bellingham where I spent that first terrified night. I do it to remember, to honor the woman who was brave enough to trade everything familiar for everything possible. And sometimes, when I'm there, I see other vans with nervous-looking drivers inside. People who are just beginning their own journeys, away from lives that don't fit anymore. I don't approach them. Everyone needs space to figure out their own path. But I send a silent message across the parking lot. You're not crazy. You're not failing. You're not alone. And the people laughing don't understand yet that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit that the life everyone else thinks you should want isn't the life you actually need. The laughter has mostly stopped now, replaced by curiosity, admiration, even envy from people who wish they had the courage to redefine success on their own terms. But I don't miss it. That laughter served its purpose. It showed me who I was when everything else was stripped away. It showed me that I was stronger than I knew, braver than I felt, and capable of building something beautiful from what everyone else saw as broken. And now, when I hear that familiar sound of judgment and disbelief directed at someone else who's making a choice that looks crazy from the outside, I don't cringe. I smile. Because I know something the laughers don't know yet. Sometimes what looks like an ending is actually a beginning. Sometimes what looks like falling is actually flying. And sometimes the very thing that makes people laugh is the thing that sets you free.